The Department of Communications is scheduled to meet with the broadcasting signal distributor Sentech today to avoid switching off 17 community radio stations. The stations located in various parts of the country reportedly owe Sentech a 33 million rand in signal fees. Millions of people rely on these media platforms for information. But to take this discussion further, we joined by Katlego Sepotokele from the Right2Know Campaign, and he joins us live from our studios in Parliament. Katlego, good morning to you. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, if as many as 17 community radio stations are unable to pay their signal fees, does this imply that either the fees are too high or perhaps maybe none of the stations are financially well run?
I beg your pardon, could you please repeat the question?
Yeah, I was saying that if we're talking about 17 community radio stations that are unable to pay their signal fees, what does this mean? Does it imply that maybe perhaps the fees are too high or none of the stations are financially well off?
Sure. I think it speaks to a larger context of the fact that community radio stations or community media, the community media sector, hasn't been receiving any sufficient support, from the state. We know that the history of South African community media has been one of painstaking resilience. So I think, on one hand, yes, it may have to deal with affordability, but I think largely it deals with policy gaps around having sufficient support for the community radio media sector. So I think that needs to really be addressed.
Yeah, but this challenge, besides the state having to come on board to assist in this regard, let's just talk about the role of the private sectors where these community radio stations are operating. Are they also perhaps doing enough to sort of support the sustainability of these radio stations?
I think when we also think about a sustainability model, we need to think about how also the state can also participate in ensuring that we have sufficient mechanisms in ensuring that there is sustainable support to radio stations. Yes, you find that government is still very much when you look at advertising revenue, there still has not been very quite sufficient, adequate distribution of advertising revenue. So there are various ways in which the state can support the community radio media sector.
Yeah, I've myself worked for radio stations many years ago, and I do know that we then relied mainly on the advertisement revenue coming through from the shops that were operating that area. But let's just talk about the dependency of the communities on these radio stations.
The dependency of?
Of the communities on community radio stations.
On the radio station?
Yes.
Yes. Community radio stations are an important part of the cultural, the social, the political, and economic lives of communities, right? So there is a very much of a constitutional and public interest case to be made around the switch-offs, because the community radio sector has been that important thread, that has held communities in terms of providing information and resources and other forms of, other services like, public education. So I think that the role of community radio cannot be really minimized. Because they really play quite an important role in democratization of media and our democracy at large.
Yeah, they certainly do. Now, you say that some radio stations have already been switched off and others have been threatened. So I'm reading now this morning that Sentech has actually confirmed that it has reached a payment agreement with 4 of the 17 community broadcasters that were initially pulled off air. Talk to us about that.
Can you please repeat that? Like, the sound is really quite poor.
Yeah, apologies on that. I see that you're struggling to hear us. But my question really is, you as the Right to Know campaign are saying that
Yes.
some radio stations have already been switched off, and others, as we've been reporting, that they have been threatened to be taken off air.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about this, because I'm reading this morning that Sentech has actually confirmed that it has reached a payment agreement with 4 of the 17 community radio stations involved.
You know, there have been stations which I can't name who have received notices of cut-offs. And we're hearing really quite a lot of information that has been, flowing. But what I know is that tomorrow there will be a sit-in with the National Community Radio Forum with the Department of Communication to sort out this issue. But what is in my knowledge is that there are a couple of radio stations, a couple of community radio stations that have received notices to be switched off. So at this point, what we can say is that we'll see from tomorrow's engagement what the outcome of that engagement is. And then we'll be able to sort of gauge what we can take forward from what happens from, the outcome of those discussions. But at this point, really, there's this meeting that is happening tomorrow, and there's just a lot of information that has been passing on that is not being really verified. But there have been, I can say that there have been community radio stations that have received notices of switch off.
All right, I suppose we'll wait and see what comes out of that meeting taking place today with the Minister of Communications, Nomvula Mkonyane. Thank you so much, Katlego, for coming through.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much indeed. Katlego Sepotokele from the Right to Know campaign, talking to us about Sentech, of course, having announced that they'll be taking about 17 community radio stations off air, of course. But that meeting taking place with the minister today, as I said, we'll wait and see what comes out of that meeting. All right, 23 minutes after 8 o'clock, you're on Morning Live. It's time for your final spot.